Tired of your car insurance rate going up even with a clean driving record? You're not alone. That's why there's Jerry, your proactive insurance assistant. Jerry compares rates side by side from over 50 top insurers and helps you switch with ease. Jerry even tracks market rates and alerts you when it's best to shop. No spam calls, no hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Switch with confidence. Download the Jerry app or visit jerry.ai/ACAST today.
We get it. There are too many car insurance companies trying to convince you that they have the best car insurance rates. We don't think we need to convince you. We're Root, and we do car insurance differently. We don't think it makes sense to only base your car insurance rate on things that have nothing to do with your driving, like your occupation or education. When you take the test drive using the Root app, we price your car insurance rate primarily on how you drive. It's that easy. Just download the Root app, drive around like you normally would for a couple of weeks, and get a quote based primarily on how you actually drive. Good drivers could save up to $900 a year when they switch to Root. We're taking an old industry and making it fair. Root Insurance, because better drivers deserve better rates. Download the app today and see how much you could save. Terms and conditions apply, subject to underwriting review. See root.com for details.
Welcome to episode number 280 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Emerald, Danielle Pordash, Amy Hone, Denise Kath, and Alison LL. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Annihilation. Annihilation was released in 2018. It has 6.8 out of 10 on IMDb and 88% on Rotten Tomatoes. Lena, a biologist and former soldier, joins a mission to uncover what happened to her husband inside Area X, a sinister and mysterious phenomenon that is expanding across the American coastline. Once inside, the expedition discovers a world of mutated landscapes and creatures, as dangerous as it is beautiful, that threatens both their lives and their sanity. This film really surprised me. Honestly, it was just visually stunning and really quite mind-bending. It's genuinely worth watching just for the scenery and the flora and the fauna. It was such an inventive take on an alien invasion story, right? And I didn't really know what to expect from it. I didn't know that much about it, but then watching it, I was, generally quite intrigued by what was happening. And I thought it's kind of such a welcome change to have, I'm calling it an alien invasion story, but it's not really, because it's relatively passive. Something happens on this piece of land and then it starts to expand and it changes everything that's inside it. And they refer to it as a shimmer, as, the shimmer. And I kind of imagined it as a dome that's getting bigger and bigger and changing everything that's inside it. And no one really knows what's happening or what's really going on. And I thought it was an interesting take on an alien invasion story, And the idea of this shimmer growing quietly, slowly, relentlessly was really interesting, because the scientists who were studying it were all watching it happen and scratching their heads and being like, we don't know what's happening here. And it was, that was a novel concept, I thought. And it felt like this really sort of philosophical, cosmic horror. And I did see some people in the comments kind of blasting it, right, as pretentious, which I can kind of get on board with. I can see that people would find it difficult, pseudo-intellectual, a bit pretentious. And I think it's interesting, it encompasses a lot of themes. I thought there was a lot about loss and relationships and identity and your sense of self and self-destruction and what drives people to go on what is essentially a suicide mission, and what does that mean? What does that tell you about them? And that means there's a lot to try and concentrate on. It feels like a sort of a discussion movie, you know? If I'd gone to see it in the cinema, I know that I would have come out afterwards and been like, whoa, I don't know how I feel about that. Let's talk about this aspect of it, and let's, you know, dig down into this theme. So I think there's probably discussions you could have for days about this film. And I think you could easily say that about this film regardless of whether you loved it or hated it. You know, that even if you disliked it immensely, there's a lot of discussion to be had about those themes and maybe why you disliked it. I did like, you know, on a very basic level, the fact that the team that goes in to investigate the Shimmer is a team of women, which is always welcome. And Natalie Portman plays the lead scientist, and I thought she was really good. Like a decent, solid performance. I always get Natalie Portman and Keira Knightley mixed up. I've got this thing about faces where I can't really recognise them very well. I don't know if I've always not recognised them very well, but Natalie Portman and Keira Knightley are two actors that I just cannot distinguish between. So I spent a lot of the film thinking I was watching Keira Knightley, but I wasn't. I was watching Natalie Portman, who was very good, I would say, in the film. There is a scene in the film that I thought was genuinely one of the best horror scenes in a film that I've seen in a very long time. It was terrifying. It is a scene with a bear in it. If you have watched this film, you'll know exactly what scene I'm talking about. But there's a scene with a bear in it. And I literally was watching it in my house with some friends, right? And I literally turned to them and I said, is that noise coming from that bear? And it was harrowing. It was like spine tingling, terrifying. And in terms of my dislikes for this film, I feel like Alex Garland, who I adore, right? He wrote and directed this film. But I do feel like sometimes there's an issue with the last 15 minutes of his films. And I don't want to like ruin the ending for anybody, so there's kind of no spoilers here. But I felt like there was this protracted scene at the end with, I don't know, an entity, let's call it that. And I was like, I get it. I get it. I understand, kind of, I think I understand what's happening. Please stop dragging this on, you know? And I remember feeling the very same way about the film Men. I thought this metaphor was sort of hammered home at the end in this really blunt force way that just went on and on and on, and I really disliked it. And I just felt like something about that scene dragging on in the way that it did actively felt pretentious, and I felt like it could have been a lot shorter and still had the same impact. And I think that it could be accused, this film, of being overly pretentious, and I've seen it sort of described as pseudo-intellectual, and yeah, I can see it. You know, I really had to kind of focus and concentrate to try and figure out the scientific theories that were at play and what that meant, and maybe it wasn't fleshed out enough. Listen, maybe I'm just not the target audience, or I just didn't understand it properly or whatever, which is always a possibility. But there was something about kind of all the different themes that it attempted to encompass that kind of, I felt a bit like, oh God, I'm sort of not understanding some of these threads. And I kind of fundamentally didn't really care about the characters. I was glad that the team were all women. I thought, yeah, cool, we like that. But I just didn't really care about them. And that's never really a good thing in a horror film, because you need some sort of emotional attachment to the characters in some way. Even if it's hatred, even if you're like, I can't wait for that person to die. You know, you need something. And I felt like I didn't connect with them. And I also didn't like the actual ending, okay? I just felt a bit disappointed in it. I was a bit like, oh, okay, well, I don't really feel inspired by this ending. But I will say, fundamentally, it's a decent film, you know? I'm giving it 3 stars, and I think it's genuinely worth watching for the visuals and for that bear scene alone, because that bear scene, whew, that was a stroke of genius. Today's episode is brought to you by Hormone Harmony. You were probably told that your health starts in your gut, but if you're a woman, it starts with your hormones. And I can tell you from experience that when your hormones are off, everything is off, including digestive issues, mood, energy levels, weight management, and so much more. Hormone Harmony is a game changer for women struggling with hormonal imbalances that leave them exhausted both physically and mentally. It only contains science-based ingredients that bring back comfort, energy, clarity, confidence, and a sense of balance. Happy Mammoth, the company that produces Hormone Harmony, is famous for its zero compromise policy. No GMOs, artificial fillers or flavours or any other junk. Only science-backed ingredients in amounts that are clinically proven. The company surveyed 1,831 women to see how Hormone Harmony helped them. And the results are pretty mind-blowing. 86% of women started losing weight, 77% say it improved their mood, and 100% said they're feeling like themselves again. Hormone Harmony has over 50,000 raving reviews from women all over the world, with 98% of them saying they'd gladly recommend it to their family and friends. You can try Hormone Harmony risk-free and get 15% off your first order with code GHOSTPOD at checkout. That's code GHOSTPOD for 15% off your first order.
Hey, good drivers. Yeah, we're talking to you, the ones who don't speed, the ones who avoid those fender benders, and who always use their turn signal. Congratulations, you're a better driver, and that means you could get better rates with Root Insurance. It's time to stop paying for other people's bad driving habits. You know, like the ones who cut you off just to slam on their brakes. Or the lead foot speeding to work every day. With Root Insurance, you'll get a quote based primarily on your driving. Just download the Root app, drive around like you normally would for a couple of weeks, and boom, you'll get a quote that actually makes sense. It's that easy. Root, because better drivers deserve better rates. Download the Root app today and see how much you could save. That's Root Insurance. Terms and conditions apply. Subject to underwriting review. See root.com for details.
You know what's wild? Most people are still overpaying for car insurance just because it's a pain to switch. That's why there's Jerry. Jerry's the only app that compares rates from over 50 insurers in minutes and helps you switch fast with no spam calls or hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Before you renew your car insurance policy, do yourself a favor. Download the Jerry app or head to jerry.ai/ACAST.
Which brings us to our stories this week. Now, our stories this week are a bit of a compilation, as you would have seen by the title of this episode. So we're looking at emergency services providers, first responders, who have experienced weird and paranormal stuff. And we've covered this topic before. We've covered it a few times, right? And anytime I do a call out for what people want to hear, this is one of the most popular requests, emergency services. And there is a possibility that some of these stories, I don't think any of them are repeated, but there is always the possibility, because I've done episodes like this in the past, and I think I've done episodes like this on Patreon, and there are also several other podcasts that will have done similar stories. And often, you know, we find stories from the same pool of stories. So if you've heard these stories before, I apologise, but let's get into it. It takes great courage and strength to risk your own life in the course of helping others during their greatest moments of need. Emergency service providers and first responders are often the first people on the ground in the wake of tragedy and catastrophe, big and small. They are often alone or in small numbers, and they often face dangers most of us will either never have to or will only come into contact with once or twice in our entire lifetimes. And they see things many of us never hope to see. They hear things, feel things, and witness things that most of us can't even begin to imagine were possible. For them, humanity's most heartbreaking and devastating moments become the everyday. But what happens when the everyday turns shocking, even for the bravest and most battle-hardened among us? First responders are often the unwilling witnesses to the unexplainable. to moments and situations that leave the hairs on the back of their arms standing up on end. And when someone who has seen it all throws up their hands and says they have no idea what it is that they're seeing, well, perhaps that's when we should take their stories even more seriously than we did before. Today you'll hear a sample of some of emergency services providers' most chilling tales. Ghost calls, or phantom calls, are a common issue that emergency service operators have to deal with every day. This is defined by a call coming in where no one speaks on the other end. Sometimes it's because the person in need is being watched or risks being overheard if they say anything. Sometimes they come in from pocket dials or misclicks. Either way, the operator has to determine their next course of action. If the person on the other end hangs up, the operator will call them back. But whether the person speaks or not, almost always a unit is dispatched to check the property the call came in from just in case. Even when the location isn't exactly a savoury one to begin with. That is what the Pueblo Police Department in Colorado discovered in the summer of 2018, when they received a phone call at about 3:30 in the morning. No one spoke on the other side. There was just static before the line went dead, and the operator was left with no further information. Wanting to re-establish contact, the dispatcher called back, and their call was answered. But all their dispatcher heard on the other end was more static. It was the middle of the night. If anyone in that location was in need of help, it would be hours before a civilian showed up to give it to them. So the dispatcher sent units to search the location, which just so happened to be the Imperial Memorial Gardens funeral home. When officers arrived at the scene, they found the place locked and the lights off. No one was home. No one living, that is. After reaching out to the funeral home owners, the Pueblo Police Department discovered that staff had gone home for the evening and no one would be returning until the morning. There should have been no one inside to either make the initial phone call to 911 or to answer the following call afterwards. The officers on the scene were left with a choice: investigate further and possibly uncover something that they would never be able to unsee, or let sleeping dogs lie. Probably just line trouble, right? Responding Captain Tom Rummel reported to his chief. Let's go with that. What is it, right, with funeral homes being haunted? I know that sounds like a stupid thing to say, but I think if I was dead, I'm not hanging around in the funeral home ringing 911. I think I'd be getting up to hijinks elsewhere. But I get, maybe you don't have a choice, you know, maybe you end up where you end up, and sometimes people end up in a funeral home not knowing why they're there and ringing the police department or ringing the emergency services. I do think it's interesting, right? Because you could say maybe the phone malfunctioned and that's why it called 911. But ringing back and somebody answering and there still being a static silence. I think that unfortunately for me, the curious bit inside me and the sort of the bit of me that likes to posture a bit, I'd be like, well, I'm going in. You know, I'm going in to see. I'd go in, I'd get bitten by a zombie, and that would be how the zombie apocalypse would start. And I'd be, you know, I'm apologetic for that, but it is just who I am. I often wonder as well with stories like these, you know, did they really just leave? You know, because I understand them thinking, oh, it's probably just line trouble and getting in contact with the owners and finding out, oh, you know what, nobody's meant to be there. But I'd probably be like, I don't know, do you just leave then? Do you go, look, it doesn't look like anything's disturbed. Everything looks okay, so we're just gonna see ourselves out. But yeah, I find it weird when places like funeral homes are said to be haunted. I'm like, oh, weird. Why haunting the funeral home? But who am I to say where people get to haunt after they die? I'm saying get to haunt like it's a privilege. The department in Pueblo, Colorado is far from the only police department to receive these ghost calls. And these departments often get more than what they bargained for. One officer online, who didn't give their location, told the story of the time they responded to one of these ghost calls. Ghost calls weren't exactly common where they were from, but weren't unheard of either. Usually they could be explained away by malfunctions either with the phone lines or with the phone line providers. But not all of them. One night the officer responded to a ghost call that came in from an address that had no phone number registered to it. The officers arrived at the scene to find the house completely empty. And after a quick search, they decided to call it an evening. But as they were leaving, one officer glanced over at the house next door, only to find that the occupant there had hanged themselves in the garage. Was this their way of letting the authorities know what had happened? Or had the call come in from a friendly neighbourhood ghost? Versions of this story are incredibly common among these threads of, emergency services providers and things they've experienced, that a call will come from inside a house and fundamentally somebody has died inside the house prior to the call coming in. And of course there is a cynical part of me that will always think, is this just an urban legend that has, been told in police forces all over the world essentially? Or is it something else? Is this something that actually happens? We've explored stories before about phone calls from the dead. People who receive phone calls from loved ones who have just passed away and they hear them in a distant, tinny tone, or, they're static and they hear their voice in the static, or even just a phone call from that person's phone number. There's lots of different ways that the dead seem to communicate with us via the phone. And maybe there's a desire for the body to be found in this instance. If we believe that there is an entity or a soul or whatever you want to call it, a spirit that lives inside us, and when we die that spirit is released, whatever that means, maybe there's a deep desire for our bodies to be found and to be recognised and treated with care and taken and given the proper burial or proper, send off it deserves. And look, we're never going to know how much decision making goes on in the afterlife or how much you get to think about things or whatever. But what if it's a case of, I don't want my family to find my body, but maybe I'm just overthinking it. Never quite being off the job is something that many first responders struggle with. For as long as there have been people in need, there have been those who rush towards danger to save them, no matter the personal cost. That was the kind of person Frank Levy of the Chicago Fire Department was. He was good under pressure, always kept his cool and had a smile on his face. A true pillar of his crew as they sped around Chicago during the 1920s. But the others on his team noticed that Frank seemed a bit off as he showed up for work on Good Friday in 1924. All of a sudden, Frank was quiet and distant. He wasn't cracking jokes or putting a smile on people's faces. Instead, he stared out the station house window, deep in thought. When the fire alarm came in, Frank put his hand to the window and said, "This is my last day on the fire department." The others in his crew thought this was a strange thing for him to say, but there also wasn't much time to dwell on it. A fire was blazing and had engulfed an entire building downtown, and the only ones on duty were Frank and his crew. They didn't have the same equipment that firefighters have now. They had no breathing apparatus, masks or protection for their eyes. No, firefighting back then was perhaps even more dangerous than it is now. So maybe Frank had just been hit by the gravity of the risks he was taking on a daily basis. In the chaos that ensued, the firefighters were forced to go from trying to save people and putting out the fire to just containing it. The blaze was too strong, and there wasn't much any of them could do to stop it, other than wait for it to die out on its own. By the time the dust settled, 8 people were dead. One of them was Frank Levy. Heartbroken and despondent over the loss of one of their own, the crew returned to the station to find Frank's handprint still on the window. Over time, several people attempted to wipe it away, but the print always stayed. It stayed for another 20 years until a paper boy accidentally broke the window while delivering a paper. Maybe his actions that day finally released Frank and allowed him to rest at last. I am generally more cynical in these compilation episodes than I would be in a standard listener story, right? And these are just sort of very human experiences. But there's something about this story that I found it really emotional. I do believe that there are some people who know when they're going to die. And like this story, I don't mean somebody who has an illness, somebody who maybe is in a situation where death is actually imminent for them. That's not what I mean. I mean people who are going about their day-to-day lives. Obviously, being a firefighter is a dangerous job. But Frank was being a firefighter every day. And on this particular day, he said, "This is my last day in the fire department." I do think there are some people who know when they're going to die. I'm not entirely sure what that means. Does that mean that Frank had a dream before he died? Does it mean that he had a feeling? I know that, some people have just a sense of impending doom. And we have heard versions of an imprint staying somewhere after somebody has died, whether it's a handprint, whether it's a blood stain, whether it's the mark of a body. We've had that in stories before. And I wonder first of all how much of that was added to the story afterwards, right? Because then obviously the window was broken, so there's no proof of that. But I also think we have a need to leave a mark, like sometimes literally, as humans, we want to think that we left a mark on this world, and you want to think that your death wasn't in vain, or that people will remember you. So I wonder if that's why the addition of the handprint on the window kind of ended up in this story. And again, of course, it might just be that they could never get rid of the mark on the window. And I do think that it's, important to say, and it's an obvious thing to say, that people who are firefighters, paramedics, police officers, people who are on the front line, sometimes I think, I don't know how you do this. And my own dad, it was a firefighter and then a paramedic before he retired. And I've had many interactions with the police and with emergency services through work and through my personal life over the years. And let me tell you, the level of personal tragedy that these people experience is pretty hectic. Death and loss are a common thing for first responders. If it's not the loss of one of their own, then it's something they encounter on the job. Day in, day out, and even those manning the phone lines aren't always spared. The operators at Reno, Nevada found that out the hard way when they started getting calls from an elderly woman who lived about 20 minutes out of town. The woman had lost her husband back in 2010, and ever since then, she had called 911 2 or 3 times a week. Usually she called to ask about pretty mundane things like putting the kettle on or changing the temperature on the thermostat. And instead of getting angry with her, the phone operators understood her situation. The woman was elderly and she was alone, and she was also showing early signs of dementia. When she called, the dispatchers would kindly remind her that she was calling the emergency services and that she should only call them if there was a real emergency. The woman always eventually understood that she had called the wrong people and would apologise and hang up. They never actually dispatched a unit to her house, as it was clear that the woman wasn't in any distress. She was just confused, and unfortunately, she only continued to get even more so. Over time, the woman would call 911 and address the operators as John, the name of her late husband. Oftentimes, the woman was just asking John where he was and asking for him to come home. The operators would respond by reminding her that they were the emergency services and by urging her to contact her family. But one day, on one of her now almost routine calls, the operators answered the call coming in from her address and heard the woman shouting, "John, please come home," she cried. "Help me, I need help, John, come home." The operators knew that something was very wrong, and so they dispatched a unit immediately. Officers arrived only a few minutes after the line went dead, only to find the house completely quiet. The woman had left her front door unlocked, and so, fearing the worst, the officers let themselves in and began searching the property. They found the old woman in her bed, and she had clearly been dead for hours. The official consensus was that the woman had died after placing her frantic 911 call, and that maybe the cold temperature in her house had caused rigor mortis to set in quicker than it usually would. It wasn't an easy explanation to wash away how a woman who had appeared to have been dead for hours could have placed a phone call literally only moments before, but it was one the department were going to have to take. After all, what was the other option? Were they all going to accept that a ghost had called 911? Opinions slowly settled, and a few days went by of relative quiet. There were no more phone calls where the dispatchers had to remind an elderly woman suffering from dementia that she had called the wrong number. No more requests to put the kettle on or speak with her dead husband. But then the phone rang again, and the call was coming from the same house that the woman had just died in. "I need my husband," the woman on the other end of the line screamed at the operator, clearly in a state of panic and terrified. The dispatcher tried to talk to her and get more information out of the woman, but she was too frightened and hung up. Officers on site confirmed that her house was empty, and everyone brushed it away as a sick prank. But then she called again. Every week, multiple times, a call still comes in from that property. On the other end is always an elderly woman looking for her husband. But the only problem is that now there's not even a phone or a house for the woman to call from. The property burned down a few years ago, but still the calls kept coming. I don't know. If that's not a story to make you want to go and hug your loved ones, I don't know what is. God, the combination of grief and dementia is just devastating, to be honest. And this almost feels like a stone tape theory kind of vibe, like this need for her husband to come home, this lack of understanding about why he wasn't there anymore. You know, perhaps in her dementia she sort of had forgotten and not understood that he was actually dead and not just not there for some reason. And that must have elicited such a confusion for her and such a sense of urgency and a difficulty understanding, and God, that must have created such an energy. You know, all of that fear and confusion and emotion, and probably flashes where she did remember. And all of that just feels like it's, I don't know, just opens up a world of energy that maybe lingers. And of course, there's always the possibility that it's somebody's idea of a sick prank, you know, which is an awful thing to think about. I sort of think that's almost worse than the paranormal, if that was somebody's idea of a joke. And I also think, like, in general, even before she passed away, that must have been really shit for the first responders, for the operators, hearing that and hearing this woman slip further and further into dementia and feeling helpless about the fact that she's ringing them up and looking for her husband. That must be really awful. I mean, I don't know what the rules are around this, but I feel like I hope that operators get some sort of regular counselling or supervision about the cases that they're on the other end of, you know, paranormal or otherwise. A lot of us have had that feeling that there is someone else there, that there is someone right behind us watching over our shoulder. It's an instinct buried in all of us. Ignore it at your own peril and face the consequences. Listen to it and find that you've just been spared some tragic fate. But what happens when that feeling isn't seen but heard? And what happens when it goes directly against reality? A dispatcher received a call one evening, a call that would shake most of us to our very core. On the other end of the line is a man who manages to get across in terrified whispers that there is somebody else in his house. In bursts of panicked communication, the man is able to tell the dispatcher that there are 2 other men in the house, robbing him. He has locked himself away in one of the bathrooms and can hear them rummaging through his things, debating what to take and what to leave behind. The man, taking pauses when he can hear them right outside the bathroom door, tells the dispatcher to send the police and to hurry. He can't fight back, he can't even run away. He's disabled. The only hope he has of surviving this night is if the police come and get rid of the robbers for him. The dispatcher tries to calm the man down and assures him that help is on the way. The man gasps and cries. He can hear the two other men in his home coming closer. He can hear the footsteps on the corridor just outside the bathroom door. He can see the shadows of the two pairs of feet as they stop right outside. The man sobs. The dispatcher can hear the sound of someone knocking on the bathroom door over the phone, and all seems lost. But fortunately, it's just then that the police officers arrive at the scene. The dispatcher stays on the phone while the officers cleared the house and then told the man that it was finally safe to come out. The man listens and hangs up so he can go outside and greet the officers. That was the last the dispatcher heard from the man inside the house, but it wasn't the end of the story. Later, when the officers returned and talked with the dispatcher, they said that when they had entered the house, all of the walls, the ceiling, the surfaces had been covered in aluminium foil. Intricate webs of fishing lines with bells and other booby traps had lined the house, making it impossible to move around without making a sound. There would have been no way for someone to break in without leaving marks and traces behind, and the responding officers claimed that they'd been the first to enter the house. The home had been empty, including of the homeowner, who had been sitting outside on the front porch the entire time. So who had been on the phone to the dispatcher the whole time? And who or what had the dispatcher actually heard? This story is kind of chaotic, right? And it took me ages to get my head around it. But I think the implication is that the dispatcher obviously was hearing these people going around the house, the person frantically whispering, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, there's people in the house. Heard the police officers come into the house, heard the person then get off the phone and say, oh, the police officers are here. And then obviously the police officers who went into the house didn't find anybody, and the homeowner had been outside the entire time, not in the bathroom, terrified. Because I feel like I would be like, when I left that house and then went back to the dispatcher and said, hey, this is what happened, and the dispatcher was like, that's not what I heard, I'd be like, did we leave somebody in that house that's booby-trapped to oblivion? Did the owner of that house have that experience previously where they were in the house and two people came in? Is that why the house was like booby-trapped to oblivion, you know? So that the man could hear when intruders were coming? Was it like a trauma response? And somehow again we got stuck in that almost stone tape theory situation. And then look, I haven't mentioned this before because it hurts my brain too much. What if it's just glitches in the Matrix? You know, what if it is just weird alternate timelines that are merging somehow for a period of time and it is manifesting in these phone calls? I'm no scientist, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer. I do think though that thinking about timelines like literally melts my brain. Like it hurts my brain to think about timelines. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. There were a lot of sad stories in there, so I'm sorry if I've left you on a downer. There was another sad story in there about a man being found dead, but you know what? I thought I don't want to put another sad story out into the universe, so I just skipped it. And like I said at the beginning, I don't think I've covered any of those stories before. If I have, I apologize, but thank you so much for listening. If you have a story that you would like to share, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com, and if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.